It's always a pleasure to be here with you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the African Podcast TV. This podcast is about Africa regarding the political side, the historical side, the cultural side, the economical side, so many more. Each week, I deliver my best thought and analysis regarding Africa. Here, your host, Amaduba. Please join me to welcome my guest, Cham Etienne Bama. He's the head of policy enabling Africa Trade, UK in London, and he's also the advisory board member Pan-African Women Businesses Leaders Association. Thank you so much, sir, for joining me this weekend on African Podcast TV.
Thank you as well, Mr. Ba. And I send out my greetings to the audience who are listening us across the world. It's always a pleasure to be
Thank
on
you.
board to discuss issues enabling Africa to participate in the global drive towards an inclusive development.
Thank you so much. We are here to talk about African women in business and then how that can contribute to the development of the continent. And then also we'll talk about the challenge, the issues those women face, especially in the business sector. But before that said, how do you see African women in business and what is your thought in general?
Ingenuity. The African woman is full of ingenuity, innovation, and talent.
Mhm.
When we are talking about business, we need to contextualize the African picture,
Mhm.
looking at the mother with a child on her back
Mhm.
who is doing business in a local market to the giants who are rising to make a bigger picture of female entrepreneurship on the continent.
Mhm.
The African woman has her own particularity of being able to create from nowhere
Mhm.
and to drive across a longer period of time with the smallest capital,
Mhm.
yet sustaining life of her immediate family and catering for her own personal needs. That is the picture of the African woman in business,
Mhm.
and it must be considered within context today,
Mhm.
the digital context.
Mhm.
If we look at the rising number of startups where women are engaged on the continent, it is a big boom.
Mhm.
African women are coming on the digital platform on daily basis, and
Good.
that is quite encouraging. But
Good.
yet, the picture of the continental woman in business does not go without challenges.
Mhm.
Some of the challenges are unique to Africa, while some are global challenges. So
Mhm.
we'll have time to explore all those avenues that characterize the African woman in the business sector.
Good. So, as someone who has been doing this for a long time, and that's one of your specialty, so how can we help them more to engage in the business sector? Like I said before, especially women, because we know that women and men are really different, especially in the business sector. So like you said, in the local, in the market, in the small local, you see those women, they start small and then they build it little by little. So how do you see that and how can we engage more with that to change that a little bit?
Yes, there is need to change. From a recent study that I worked on, there is a need for change. One of the challenge that I find uh, responsible for the situation of the African woman today is the fact that policies across the continent are not inclusive. Our policies are not inclusive. There
Mhm.
is still work to do at that level. And I think that is not unique to Africa. That is across the developing world.
Mhm.
Why do I say our policies are not inclusive? When we are designing legislation, there is always that tendency to believe that men and women will face the challenges at the same level. I say no. Let's take, for example, Mr. Ba, when you were in school, I
Mhm.
don't know if you started your primary education in the US or back in Africa, but the tendency is going towards the same pattern across the world.
Mhm.
The first day you enter into school, maybe in nursery school, to when you're finishing your primary school, when you look at the number of female and male pupils, students, female is dropping higher than the male.
Yes.
When you enter your secondary education, the female number keep dropping. That's a pattern that is common in Africa. And when we go to the university, it keeps a downward trend. Why do we have to look at this? This is because before now, the policies were considered as flat for everybody. Boys and girls applied the same policies without taking into consideration the specificity of female gender. This did not favor the female gender, as I want to take a peculiar case that I've been a witness of in my secondary school days. Take, for example, in secondary school, when a female student falls pregnant, back in my day, she was not allowed to continue school while pregnant.
Mm.
She was supposed to be sent out of school. And why the boy who impregnated her, who is a student as well, most often will have to continue his education. And the girl is off, maybe for 1 year. And due to societal stigma, she will not even come back to school. Maybe because her sponsors are angry and not happy with what has happened, they keep her off school. But the man will continue with his education. And at a certain level, he will achieve success and turn to look at the girl he impregnated, maybe in form 5 or lower seat. He will say, okay, I cannot get married to a lady who is not educated. So you see how our policies are gender biased. They're not inclusive. In case it was a situation where, despite her situation, taking into consideration that situation, she's not fully responsible alone, she must be considered as part of that educational family, despite her pregnancy, because the woman is the mother of humanity. But she has been sent off. 1 year she's not coming to school. Her classmates are gone. And that is how the number keeps decreasing as the educational ladder is climbing. So these are some of the policies that back in those days, they were not really favoring the emancipation of the girl child. But today, across a good number of African countries, the story is not more the same. That applies equally in the entrepreneurship domain. When we are designing our financial legislation, our economic legislation, our cultural legislation, it is gender bias. That is what studies have revealed. Studies have revealed that before now, women could not own a bank account. Do you imagine what it means for a woman not to own a bank account, Mr. Ba? She will need to take authorization from the husband before she can own a bank account. There is a problem. Now, access to capital becomes a problem to that woman. She cannot access capital because she doesn't own a bank. What is she going to do? The African woman resorted to the P2P lending. They now went into the small scale financial schemes in their neighborhood where women will come together and each Sunday they will do their P2P lending and maybe hand over the package to one of their members. This equally limited their capacity to access a reasonable amount of money that will permit them to go into big businesses. Some of these things have characterized Africa for a very long time, limiting the role of the woman in building the economy. But I think the narrative is changing on the continent, and we are seeing more and more women exploring and making big talents and huge success and driving an inclusive Africa that we all want to see.
Yes, that's a really interesting point you have been making. But I think that those policies have been changing now. If you look at a lot of countries in Africa now, women they can own their own account, they can do whatever they want, even though some families or some culture, because you don't have to forget about the culture, especially as an African. If we have to talk about the culture the most of the time because the culture has been playing a big role of that. But nowadays it has been changing, and then I think so, and then I hope so in the future it's going to change more and more again. And that's some of the things you have been doing, and thanks for your job. And in your knowledge, how do we create a favorable environment for the business success for the African women, and why is this important?
Yeah, just to say that since the Beijing Declaration in 1995 or so, a lot has changed. Different countries have taken in the right measure the place of a woman in building the society. When you take the case of Rwanda, where a majority of those in position are women, you see the change they are driving. Policies are becoming more and more inclusive with women considered from the consultation phase right to the monitoring and evaluation phase. We have seen, for example, in terms of legislature, we have been able to review legislation in many countries in the world. to put a quota. There are quota considerations in terms of political positions in parliament, in local councils. Government have been able to reform their electoral laws to consider women in terms of quota. For example, in my country, in Cameroon, 30% of legislature is made up of women. That is quite considerate. Back 50 years ago, that was not the case. We had 3 or 4 women in parliament. But today, 30% of women are in parliament. And what does that mean? It doesn't only mean for them to be sitting there as women and say the gender balance is reducing. No. They are there to ensure that when legislation is being proposed, the place of the woman is taken into consideration because they are speaking as women. They are speaking on behalf of the women. They are bringing in problems that are concerning their own gender to be discussed, to be addressed, and to be taken into consideration. And a lot has changed. I think this 30% representation in parliament has been able to transform the legislative landscape. Even through the question and answer session in parliament, women have been able to monitor and evaluate the place of inclusive legislation taken into consideration women. And we have in many countries today, we have talking about female entrepreneurship, female empowerment, women empowerment left and right. That is not rocket science today. We are seeing the result. When you take the case of most African countries, when you want to look at the basket of employment where most women are found, it is the agricultural sector. In most African countries, agricultural sector employs about 80% of the young people. And when you look at the 80%, majority are women. Why are they in the agricultural sector? We come back now to look at our educational policy. Because agricultural sector is a sector in Africa that is perceived as unskilled labor. People who have not gone to school, they can jump into this sector and they are able to make their life. And what is the bunch of this sector? It is subsistence agriculture for livelihood, and maybe the surpluses are sold in the market to be able to generate little revenue that will provide access to education, access to health, and maybe procure basic necessities for the family. But the narrative is changing. Though we have been looking at Africa from that perspective, the narrative has been changing. Those who have been given access to education have been able to rise up and be able to build on their own achievement. So the place of the woman in Africa is that which is changing. I made mention of the digital platform. Look at startups today that are digitally oriented on the continent. A good number is run by women. That is the African woman in entrepreneurship who is rising, and they are able to constitute a network at the level of the continent, especially at the level of the regional economic community. You find women in business associations like the Pan-African Business Women Association that came up. When you look at it, it is covering the entire continent. As of now, there are about close to 40 countries that are represented in the Pan-African Business Women Association. And let me assure you, by every weekend, today morning, we were on a webinar that was organized by the Pan-African Business Women Association. I'm not doing publicity here, but I'm just trying to bring a fact on how female entrepreneurship is growing on the continent. We had to discuss about the African continental free trade area and sectorial policies like agriculture, how the female entrepreneurship is being taken into consideration in the African continental free trade area. So this is quite something we have discussed in the morning. And a lot was taken home by those women who were on board. And from their questions, there is that desire to participate in the economic building of the continent by our women. It was a fantastic session. You know,
good.
The African woman is increasingly taking up a key role in building the economy of the continent.
Good. I'm really happy to hear that you have been helping those women, because my next question will be that. So how can we create a favorable environment for the women, especially in the business sector?
Yes, the favorable environment will start with policies. For us to create new laws, we need to bring in women. First, at the consultation level, we should identify, there should be stakeholder mapping. Which are the women associations or business organizations that are concerned with the new law? For example, each year, I think most of the countries across the world, they design a new finance law. In that finance law, Are women voices being heard during the consultation process? If we listen to women, they will tell us their problems. And when they tell us their problems, they will be part of the solution. Gone are those days people could sit down and decide on behalf of women. If you want to change the business environment for women, their voices must be on board. And they have fantastic and phenomenal associations which are contributing to economic development. Let them be consulted. They must be consulted. It's a non-negotiable issue. They must be consulted, and their policy position must be taken into consideration so that the laws we are putting in place should be inclusive. The women should find themselves into those laws, and their specific conditions, their challenges must be considered. Let me take the case of infrastructure. You will see that over the years, infrastructure that we are building now are becoming inclusive. For example, cross-border infrastructure, cross-border trade infrastructure. When you look at back then, infrastructure that was designed, for example, let me just go to the case of this one-stop border post that is being constructed now to cater for informal cross-border and formal cross-border trade across Africa. This is inclusive infrastructure that considers the role of the woman as an actor in international trade, and her place as a majority informal cross-border actor has been taken into consideration during the construction and designing of this infrastructure. This is thanks to the consultation process where women were heard, they were listened to, and they participated in the design, construction, and the implementation process. If that is not done, the woman will continuously feel biased and not considered by the society, therefore limiting her role to participate in the economic emancipation of Africa. There are sectors where we cannot do without the woman. Take the tourism sector, for example. When you enter into 10, 15 hotels, even if there are two men, you must find one woman at the front desk, the commercial department, in other services in the hotel and leisure sector. In restaurants, it is the same. These are sectors where if we design policies without listening to the voice of the woman, we will be working on the sideline. And that will not be good for African emancipation. Take this case of textile. The textile industry is a female-dominated industry. Take the case of Ethiopia. When you take a picture of the textile industry, you see thousands of women being employed in this sector. If you design any policy in the level of textile development without taking into consideration the specific nature of the woman, you are working out of the project. Take the case of agriculture on the continent. If you design any agricultural development policy without taking into consideration the role and the place of the woman, Mr. Bao, this project is going to fail before its implementation. So we must be inclusive in our policy design. We must consider the place of the woman, which is preponderant in policy design across the continent. Remember, more than 50% of African population is made up of women. How can we decide development without the woman being on board?
No,
that is not possible.
That's not possible at all. And then that's some of the reason why I have you here to talk about it, because I know that women has to be part of the development of the continent. Like you just said, that in everywhere, in all the sector, in agriculture, in agriculture, in the economic sector, in the all over, the woman has to be part of it. So let's talk about finance, because financing is the most important thing, especially in the business sector. Because if you look at about the finance as men and women is really different. According to the World Bank, if you look at men has like 6 times more capital than women in 10 countries in Africa. So how can we help women to get access to finance assistance, and what are the steps to take to make that happen?
Thank you very much. But that is an important problem. But I will go back to another problem, which I find much more important than finance. Capacity, the mindset. You can give 1 billion to a person. If that person's mind is not business oriented, that person will not be able to do that. Most often in the business world, we see those who have succeeded. We forget to capture a picture of those who have failed. Do you know how many Dangotes have tried and failed on the continent? Or how many Elakija have tried and failed on the continent? That is the picture we have to look at. Capacity. Once they have the capacity, they are able to do a business plan. They are able to target a specific sector, and they are able to access finance.
Mhm.
This boils back to education, as I was saying. If you look at the number of men and women who have access to education, the number of men are always more than women. In the engineering sector, in the STEM sector, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, women are more than men. Don't you think that that's one factor that can justify why men have more access to capital than women? Because they have the intellectual capacity. We need to build inclusive educational policies, technical and vocational education, tertiary education, elementary education. Once we design inclusive policies, we will be able to capacitate women to be able to access finance without any problem. Take the case of South Korea and Japan. Take the case of Singapore. Do we hear such type of debate there? We don't hear such debate in those countries. Is it because they took money and gave to women? No, they didn't. They designed an educational curriculum that was inclusive, that gave equal chances for everybody. And in that way, there was that notion of self-development that became automatic because of the system in which the society is built on. So accessing finance is a serious problem, but then we must look at the capacity of those who want to access finance.
Mhm.
Our women are fantastic, they are phenomenal, because even without this capacity, they are able to run a business. There was one time when I was working in the southwest part of Cameroon, I came across a woman who has been running a business with $200 for the past 15 years. With $200 for 15 years, she has been able to sustain her business, feeding 4 children as a single parent. Can you imagine the ingenuity in that woman? And she was doing cross-border trade between Cameroon and Nigeria in agricultural products. Can you imagine the type of mindset that woman is having? It is more than what we can even learn in formal education. So the concept of access to finance is important, but education. Now coming up to finance. When I was making an introductory remarks, I highlighted the fact that before a recent time, women were not allowed to own bank accounts in most African countries. That's already a handicap for them to be able to access finance. And even today, our commercial institutions, they will find it, they have that biased concept of responding to a woman who is accessing capital and a man who is accessing capital. I think our legislation needs to evolve by going into quota. If we have to say commercial banks today must give 30% of their annual loans to women, I think we must have brought in a very big solution. We did that in parliament, in legislature, and we've seen how it has worked. Can you tell me one parliament that has closed down in the world because there was a quota of the seats in parliament were granted to women? No, there is none. So we must evolve legislation and bring it mandatory for commercial banks to be able to grant loans, a percentage of their annual loans granted to women. And even in terms of government fundings, the World Bank, they are good, they have their studies. Now they are financing, they are doing sectorial finance through commercial banks and the International Finance Corporation. When they are sending those loans, do they mandate the International Finance Corporation to give a percentage of that loan to women? That is where we need to evolve to.
Good.
At the end of the year, we should be able to evaluate our financial institutions and say, you granted $1 billion loan this year. Can we see data proving that 30% of this loan was granted to women? That is just it. If we try that, but by the end of a decade, we will be able to evaluate the impact of that quota financing of the private sector to women. They will be phenomenal, and we'll be able to trigger a global attention on this issue of quota financing, which to me in particular is something that needs to be addressed.
Good. Good. So, do you think African women in business is important for the development of the continent, and why?
The woman is the mother of humanity. I always like to say when I'm in seminars on addressing women, I always tell them that the woman's income is directed towards the family. The man's income is directed towards his pleasure. You understand what I mean here? When you look at the women in business, when they make profit, that profit first is for the well-being of the family, her immediate family, that is her kids and her husband, and she now look at her parents and her brothers. Whereas a man, when he generates profit from his business, his ambitions immediately skyrocket beyond his immediate family well-being. He will say he wants to purchase 50 pieces of land. He wants to fly out of the country to meet a friend in maybe in Botswana or in Ethiopia. So that said, women in entrepreneurship, why is it that their role in development is crucial? It's because their income, that their revenue that they are generated from their entrepreneurship activity is directed towards the well-being of the family by providing access to health, good access to health, good education for the children, and good social facilities for our children. Maybe leisure should be intended to develop leisure activities for the children, like taking them to Disneyland, like ensuring that they have teachers at home, like ensuring that the children have supplementary educational activities that can build the capacity of the children. And this is not an anonymous aspect. This aspect trickles down in the mindset of the children, who are the future of the continent. By doing so, for example, access to computer literacy today is a little bit in some parts of the world a luxury, because majority of schools, even if they have access to computer, to IT learning, electricity failure on the continent do not give this access on a 24/7 basis. So now, these women will tend to address these issues in schools that can provide these facilities and which is not accessible for the common African. So female entrepreneurship is a leapfrog in terms of Human Development Index and in terms of the well-being of Africans, thereby providing African population with a stable access in terms of growth and development.
Good. You have been, that's a really interesting point. But just let's talk about the African governments, because if you are talking about business if you are talking about African women in businesses, we are talking about female entrepreneurship. We need the African government to do something regarding that side. So, what are the role of the African government in the women business sector, and how can they encourage and support them?
The role of the government is critical. Why? Because the government reserves the monopoly to make laws in the country. Only the government can make laws in the country. And that is why the role of the government in women's empowerment, economic empowerment, is central. First, if the government is able to design inclusive laws that takes into consideration the role of the woman, they will be providing a level playing field for men and women. And then there are specific programs. We must recognize the important role government has played since the Beijing Declaration. In most African countries today, you will find a ministry in charge of gender. I think all African countries, they have ministries in charge of gender. Why these ministries? These ministries are there to address the specific aspects of a woman in the entire government microcosm. The role of this ministry is a role that cuts across all sectors of the economy, be it in health, be it in the economy, be it in education, be it in industrial policy. The role of women in charge of gender affairs is to be able to ensure that while they are drafting policies in these various ministries, gender aspect is taken into consideration. That is a phenomenal role. I highlighted a study in which I was taking part for 2020-2021. I work with the Ministry of Gender Affairs in Cameroon. Fantastic. They have been able to develop a 10-year gender development policy. In that 10-year gender development policy, which is the role of the government, there is a lot that the Cameroon woman has achieved from 2010 to 2020 in terms of gender equality, gender access to finance, in terms of land. Before now, it was difficult for a woman in Cameroon to own land. But under the 10-year gender development policy, the place of the woman has been leveled to be equal to that of a man. This is the role of government. Without land, there cannot be female empowerment. Women empowerment cannot take place if they don't have access to land. The legislation in terms of land have been ameliorated to be able to give women the same right as a woman, as a man, to own land. That is the role of the ministry in charge of gender aspect. Women empowerment in the Ministry of SMEs. The gender focal point there has been able to work in collaboration with the Ministry of Gender Empowerment to design an inclusive gender development roadmap for entrepreneurship in Cameroon. And a good portion of budget for that ministry has been allocated to Women Business Association. In Cameroon, we have this Women Business Association, which dates back to the 80s. The Ministry of SMEs has been able to fund them to the tune of $700,000. That is a government policy to be able to empower women economically. They have empowered them with $700,000, which is given as grants for them to be able to carry out their action plan. This is the role of the government. And now, the government is supposed to also accompany them in terms of international access to markets. How is government doing that? When government is participating in trade fairs, government does not do business. Government is supposed to map out women businesses and tell them that we have a trade fair, inter-Africa trade fair that is coming up in Kigali in Rwanda. We need 30 women entrepreneurs that we will finance to take part in inter-Africa trade fair in Kigali. Government now will take care of their flights, their lodging, their exhibition. That is the role of government. Government will sit by their side in Rwanda, be able to accompany them when businesses are coming in, to sign partnership with them. Government will sit there and say, yes, I can guarantee this partnership. These are women businesses in my country that I am supporting. So if you sign partnership with them, we as a government will be able to ensure that the execution of this partnership is done smoothly. Trade support institutions that are government institutions are supposed to equally put in place capacity building programs that are targeting women only. They are supposed to put in place awards to also recognize women in business that are striving to create mentorship programs where successful women become mentors to other women who are still growing in that sector, to be able to mentor them, to be able to champion them and take them through the path which has led to their success. That is the role of the government. As a central actor in terms of women empowerment, the government is supposed to look at international conventions like the Buenos Aires Declaration of the World Trade Organization and capture this global development agenda in terms of women in trade and see how they can reform national legislation. For example, women in procurement. In most African countries, women are not considered in the procurement, government procurement role. Why? Because this government procurement legislation does not take into consideration the role of the woman in terms of access to finance, as you highlighted, in terms of capacity, in terms of land ownership, which for the past number of years has not really been able to give a level playing ground for the women. So governments are taking stock of their own role in terms of women economic empowerment. And I think a lot is changing on the continent.
Good. Just let's talk about, because we have been talking about the challenges, we have been talking about some issues, and then we have been talking about the role of the government. So just in general, as someone who has been doing this for many years, so what are the solutions to take to help women in the business sector for the future?
Thank you. As solutions, one of the major things is let the right place of the woman be given. The right place of the woman should be given by government. Women are very active in civil society. Women are very active in the entrepreneurship sector. How is the right place to be given? Government should be able to structure these women business associations such that in terms of policy design, women should be able to put in place a structured argument that raises their own particularity to be taken into consideration in terms of policy design. Why do I emphasize in terms of policy? But without policy, nothing can be done. Because once the law is there, anybody must apply the law. If government says today, commercial banks must grant 30% of loan to women. Any bank that does not grant that 30% of loan to women will be violating the law and they must be sanctioned. So policy design is cardinal in order to enhance the participation of women in international trade and industrial policy of our country. And infrastructure development is another aspect. When I talk about infrastructure, I'm talking about energy infrastructure, transport infrastructure. These two infrastructures are infrastructure that drives the economy. Without energy, no industry can be set up. Without roads, they cannot move raw material to their industrial site. They cannot move their produce to the market. These are the challenges that the entire continent is facing. Market linkage. Yes, I'm able to produce. How do I move my goods to the market? And some of these challenges are faced by both men and women. We must recognize that. Infrastructure, energy, legislation. When we look at the World Bank doing business evaluation, the judicial system, when we are reforming our judicial systems, they must consider the role of the woman. The fiscal policy, we must design a fiscal policy which takes into consideration the place of the woman. For example, in terms of the investment code is just flat. It talks about figures in terms of money, it talks about size of the industry, but it does not take into consideration sectors where women are preponderant, like the agricultural sector, like the services sector, the tourism sector, where women are preponderant. These are things that we need to review and consider the place of the women when we are designing our investment codes, when we are designing our fiscal legislation, when we are working on judicial reforms, access to justice. Are women having the same access to justice as men? That must be considered. Land, access to land, I earlier highlighted. Without no land, there can be no industry because industries are fixed on land. So we must work on inclusive land tenure access for men and women. Cross-border trade. Our cross-border trade in terms of trade facilitation, we must consider women when we are designing our trade facilitation roadmap for the upcoming years. Women are preponderant in terms of informal cross-border trade. How do we move into a simplified trade regime? Taking into consideration the chunk of trade where women are present, cosmetics, agriculture. How do we design this informal cross-border trade into the simplified trade regime, considering the role of women? That must be taken into consideration if we have to empower the woman so that she can play the right role at the right level in our African society.
Thank you so much, sir. We are about to end this interview. Before I end the interview, would you like to add something?
Thank you. What I want to add is that a lot is changing on the continent. The African Union is playing its role. Our development partners, the World Bank, Economic Commission for Africa, the African Development Bank. For example, when you look on the website of the African Development Bank, there is a program to address female entrepreneurship. All this work is geared towards building an inclusive Africa. And I must tell you, the woman is on the race and she is playing a phenomenal role. So the African woman should not more be looked onto as a woman back 20, 30 years ago, but they should be looked onto in the mirror of an Africa where the woman has taken her rightful place.
Thank you so much, sir, for joining me this weekend on African Podcast TV.
Thank you.